I don't take charity.
Good. Ain't offering any.
Rejected bride with fire in her eyes. Found the only man who didn't fear. Her strength Copper Bluff Depot, Wyoming territory. Autumn 1879. The train's whistle tore through the dry air and died against the mountains, leaving only dust and shame behind. Joanna Hale stood alone on the platform, Boston silk already gray with travel. The man who'd promised her a home had just said she was too fierce to be a wife. Around her, the crowd looked away, as if strength in a woman were a sin. If this broke your heart too, drop a Hashon below and tell her story deserves better. The wind lifted her veil like a flag of surrender, but she didn't bow. She met the man's eyes and said quietly, "Then you'll forgive me for misunderstanding what kind of man you are." Randall Pike flinched, not from guilt but inconvenience, a man troubled by too much talk and not enough compliance. "I require a wife who minds," he said. "Obedience, a soft temper." "What you require," she said, folding the letter he'd sent and tucking it flat into her glove, "is a servant you can call wife." Someone near the freight office chuckled. Another voice, oily amused, whispered, "Too fierce by half." The platform smell was all coal iron and old wood. The telegraph key ticked like a nervous heart in the office window. Beside the cattle pens, a tall man stood in a pocket of shadow, a bay horse, shifting under his patient hand. He'd watched the refusal without blinking, as if measuring the weight of a thing no one else could hold. Luke Carver's hat brim cut a wedge of shade over eyes the color of weathered sky. A pale scar ran from his temple along the jaw, an old story he didn't tell, a map of something burned and survived. Joanna lifted her trunk. The straps bit her palms. Pride kept her spine straight, though her knees softened under the weight. She crossed the street to the boarding house, where lace curtains softened the windows, and a painted sign promised respectable rooms by the night. Mrs. Winthrop opened the door a hand's breadth. She smelled of lye and starch. Her eyes did not. "We don't take unaccompanied ladies without a reference. I was to be married today." Joanna's throat tightened only on the last word. The gentleman changed his mind. Mrs. Winthrop said with the knowing of a woman who has seen talk turn to trouble. "Then you'll want the church or the eastbound train, not my steps." The door shut with the gentle certainty of a hymn's final chord. The sun slipped behind the grain mill and left the street the color of old copper. At the livery, a lantern blinked on one small star, opened at earth level before the heaven's true lights came out. Someone laughed in the saloon. Someone else coughed hard enough to rattle nails. A dog barked at the freight wagon and lost interest. Her trunk slid an inch as her fingers gave. She braced for the drop and the crack of wood. A man's shadow fell across it. The trunk rose without a grunt. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, steady. "You'll freeze once the sun's gone." "I'll manage," she said. The words were habit and armor. They didn't fit the shape of the evening. "You can walk or ride," he said, tipping his chin at the bay. "Either way, your trunk is coming out of the street." "I don't take charity." "Good," he said, starting toward the livery with the trunk balanced like a sack of oats. "Ain't offering any." Inside, the air was warmer, soft, with hay and animal breath. He set the trunk down by a clean stall. Horses turned their heads to look ears like questions. He poured coffee from a blackened pot into a tin cup and passed it over. The steam kissed the cold from her face. "Name's Luke Carver," he said. She considered keeping her own back, but the cup warmed more than her fingers. "Joanna Hale." "You got anyone in Copper Bluff, Miss Hale? I had a promise." He didn't look away when she said it. His eyes stayed on hers, and the kindness of that, not pity, not hunger, undid one stitch she'd tied too tight around her chest. "Folks break promises easier than green sticks," he said. "Stove's hot. You can take the grain sacks by the fire if you don't like the floor. I'll pay you for the coffee." She reached for her purse. 2 coins clinked like brittle teeth. He shook his head. "You already did. With the look you gave on that platform. Not many can stand under that kind of weather without folding." Silence drew in. The stove ticked. Somewhere a horse snorted and stamped the iron ring of shoe on plank. "You watched," she said. "Wasn't my business," he answered. "Till it was." What changed it? He turned a sliver to set another log in the fire. Flame leapt orange as a living thing, washing one side of his scar and leaving the other to the shadow. You didn't beg. The coffee bit bitter and perfect at the back of her tongue. She remembered a different fire, the Warfield tents, stitched of canvas and prayer, the way men cried for water that couldn't be spared, the weight of a body gone from hot to not. She'd learned then that begging rarely moved a thing worth moving. I was a nurse, she said, surprised to hear herself tell him anything. In Virginia 64. I know what folding looks like. He nodded once, something like respect banked behind the quiet. Then you know to sleep. Dawn makes better plans than midnight. She meant to refuse again. Instead, she slid to the grain sacks by the stove and tucked her skirts under. Heat breathed up through the rough weave. The lamp burned low, humming. Luke set his hat on a peg, rolled his sleeves, and vanished into the soft business of tending animals that trusted him. The last sound she knew before sleep was the clean clink of a bucket at the pump, and the hush of water pouring into a trough, truth, finding its level even in a town that had watched her almost drown. Somewhere between dark and dawn, a hand lifted the blanket edges to her shoulders, with a care she felt more than saw. She did not wake fully. She dreamed of stars dusted over black hills, of a mare nickering to her foal, of a fire that warmed without burning. She woke hard at first light. The roof slats made stripes of gold across the straw. The bench where Luke had sat was empty. Her trunk was gone. Her breath picked up a rabbit's stutter. She stood too fast. The livery tilted. The door stood open to air that smelled of pinyon smoke and frost. Not the livery door, the cabin's. A kettle sang on a stove with an honest blue flame. A narrow bed pressed into one wall, quilts tidied. On a chair, a man's coat old and brushed clean. Her trunk leaned against the far wall like a faithful dog returned on its own. He came in with the morning at his back, 2 tin cups balanced in a long hand. You fainted, he said, setting one cup on a small table rubbed smooth by use. Livery roof leaks. This roof don't. She took the cup. Coffee and pine smoke, and something like safety, rose with the steam. Where am I? Silver Creek Ranch, he said. Mine, for better or worse. His mouth tugged as if the joke hurt and healed at once. There's work here for anyone who wants to earn their keep. Fence needs mending, hands need feeding. You said you don't take charity. You don't have to. She stared past him to the open threshold. The yard was all pale grass and frost-silver wire. Beyond, hills lifted like a cupped hand holding up the sky. A bay mare tossed her head in a corral, breath white as prayer. The shame from yesterday had cooled to something fiercer, a coal that could glow a long time if tended. You don't even know me. Luke set his cup down, the small sound neat as a period. I know enough. You didn't break when it would have been easiest. And you carried that trunk till it near carried you. Joanna wrapped both hands around the cup. Heat seeped through glove and bone. Are you afraid of difficult women, mister? Carver, ma'am, he said, the corner of his mouth easing. Fierce don't scare me none. She meant to answer quick and sharp, but a tremor ran under her skin, spent strength collecting its bill. She sat down before she fell. The room swayed, once then steadied. He looked at her without panic, the way you look at a horse that's danced in a storm. Eat first, he said. Then tell me what you want next. The kettle sang louder. Outside, a horse stamped. A star still hung pale in the west, where the night refused to quit completely. Joanna exhaled. I want, she said, surprised by the taste of the words, to earn the roof above me, just for today, and see tomorrow when it comes. Luke nodded like a man who had no use for grand plans, and every use for steady ones. He handed her a plate cornbread, a slice of salt pork, a spoonful of beans that had cooked slow through the night. The first bite made her eyes sting in the cleanest way. By the time the sun burned through the last frost on the rail, she'd rolled up her sleeves. The rescue Silver Creek Ranch. Later that morning, the sky started clear as a washed plate, the kind of blue that pretends nothing bad ever happens. Breath smoked out of men and horses alike. The smell was pine and iron and coffee gone to memory. Luke moved through the yard in long, unhurried lines, a man stitched to his place by work rather than fear. He showed her the pump by the kitchen door. Pull slow. She sings if you rush her. The handle creaked. Water rose cold and honest silver as coin. Joanna cupped her palms and sipped. It tasted like a truth said plainly. "You patchin' to run come noon?" he asked, almost casual, setting a coil of wire down by the fence line. "I said I'd earn the roof for today." She set the bucket on the step. "What needs doing? Pens need mucking. Stove needs wood. I'll run the south fence. If you've a mind, you can sweep the cabin, if it don't wound your pride to tidy a place that ain't yours yet." She smiled without meaning to. "I've cleaned blood from shirts at midnight. I can sweep." He nodded and went to saddle the bay. She watched the ease of him with the mare, the quiet way he spoke, the gentle palm at her neck. The horse flicked an ear. The other followed. Acceptance. Inside she found a broom, a washtub, a rag cut from an old shirt. She opened windows to the thin Sunday. Dust rose like ghosts and drifted out one shore, becoming proof of breathing. When she bent to the stove, the day's first flame caught and licked the kindling, small, light but faithful. With each motion, humiliation thinned. Something steadier stepped into its place, work's mercy. A crooked nail snagged her sleeve and drew a thread. She bit it free and laughed a short sound that startled her. She was alive enough to mind a sleeve. By noon, the cabin smelled of soap and beans. Luke came back with a scrape on his knuckles and a strand of wire singing from tension. He washed at the pump water, splashing his scar and collar, and took the tin bowl without asking for it, as if her thought had reached his hand. "You keep house like you've done it 100 years, he said. "I kept men," she said then, flushed. "I mean bandages, camp, cots. The way a tent becomes a world if you tell it to." He nodded. "A house ain't much different from a herd. Both run better when someone tends with their head on." He tilted his chin toward the corral. "You ride. I sat a pony in Boston once," she said. "He made a fool of me and enjoyed it." He smiled with half his mouth, which was somehow more than most men managed with the whole of theirs. "This mare don't make fools. She makes decisions. That's different." He saddled the bay and shortened the stirrups. Up. She hesitated only as long as pride would let her. The mare's warmth soaked through her skirts. Luke's hand steadied her knee, then fell away like a respectful word. He led them into the field step by deliberate step, the grass whispering against the mare's fetlocks, the mountains watching like old judges who had seen worse and better and didn't speak of either. "Look where you mean to go," he said. "Hands quiet, heels easy. She'll meet you halfway if you give her the notion." Halfway. The mare's back rocked, the leather creaked, the day opened a little. Joanna breathed deeper than the station had allowed. They followed the creek, its voice quick with snowmelt, even this late in the year. Cottonwoods lifted pale coins of leaves. A hawk circled like a thought you meant to catch later. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words fit the land. "Folks in town'll talk," he said, finally swinging down to check a split rail. "They'll call you what they don't have to be brave enough to be. What'll they call you? A man too stubborn to know better." She looked at the creek's bright running. "And are you most days," he said. "But I know a thing worth standing in front of when I see it." The mare blew soft through her nose. Joanna didn't ask if he meant the ranch, the fence, or her. The question sat warm and inexplicable at the base of her throat like good whiskey. Clouds stacked slow in the west, the innocent kind that mean well until they don't. By mid-afternoon the wind changed. Its mind came down from the ridge with a metallic taste, old coins on the tongue. Luke noticed first. His shoulders tensed under the linen. He glanced to the house, to the sky, to the range of hills that gathered weather like gossip and slung it toward this little pocket of working life. "We'll stable her," he said. "Storm's got ideas." Joanna swung down clumsy and triumphant. The ground felt farther away than it had ever been. Luke took the reins and they jogged for the barn. The first drops were big enough to count. The third clap of thunder rolled like a wagon down a hill. In the doorway, the mare balked a lightning flash, stitched the sky open, sewing it up with sound a heartbeat later. Luke raised a hand to calm her. "With me, girl." The horse went tight as a fist. "Let me," Joanna said. He didn't argue. She stepped close enough to feel the mare's breath smelled hay and thunder. "You and me," she whispered. "We don't spook at noisy men or noisy skies." The mare stretched her neck, breathed into Joanna's palm. A soft step, then another. They were inside. The rain hit the roof hard enough to make the boards hum. The storm came like a judgment and a baptism both. Lightning forked behind the distant ridge. Pastures flashed white, then returned to the natural dark. Luke swung the door nearly shut and bolted it 3/5 enough to keep the worst out, enough to keep the air from going stale. Wind found every crack anyway, singing in a dozen different keys. "Loose boards on the north wall," he said over the din. "Been meaning to fix 'em. Meanings got poor timing." A seam in the wall shivered. The mare danced. Joanna caught the lead rope and braced heels, deep skirts damp around her boots. Luke went for a hammer and nails. Another flash. Another slam of sky. The northwest corner quivered, then gave a section no wider than a man's shoulders, but wide enough for the wind to punch through and try to take what it wanted. Luke set his shoulder to the gap muscles carving their own map in the wet shirt. The hammer struck 1, 2, 3. The board bit held slipped. The mare surged, shoving Joanna sideways. She hit a post, saw white felt splinters through wool. Her fingers held anyway. "It's all right," she told the horse, and herself at once. "We're not breaking." He looked over rain and sweat and lamplight, making half his face flame and the other half stone. "You done this before, held men together with worse," she said. "Keep hammering." A gust shoved hard enough to take breath. A second board popped. He swore once not at God but at timber. She dragged a hay bale to the breach and shouldered it up with him. For a blink they were pressed close, wet breathing alive, and then the bale settled where it would do the most good. He nailed crosswise. She held with her back and her stupid, persevering bones. The worst passed in that untidy way storms have of leaving you mid-sentence. The rain eased to something that sounded like applause from far away. The thunder moved off to bother other hills. Wine downshifted to a tired uncle's sigh. Luke stepped back, chest lifting and falling like a bellow. He set the hammer on the stall rail with hands that had learned careful in a hard school. "You all right, Miss Hale?" Joanna checked herself head to heel. A bruise grew under the skin below her ribs, hot as a coal. Her hair had come down in storm-tangled ropes. She felt what she'd felt holding a soldier's wrist and finding, after too long, a pulse. "I'm right as rain," she said, then laughed at the wrongness of the phrase, and amended soft, "right as what comes after." He moved to her without hurry eyes, asking permission. His mouth didn't. "May I?" His fingers hovered close to her side, and then stopped. "You'll have a mark." "I'm a map of them," she said. "They're how I know where I've been." They stood listening to the roof tick and resettle. The mare chewed thoughtfully, having decided to live. The lamp threw a small circle of gold into which they both fit barely. "You're not soft-tempered," Luke said at last. "Did you want one who was?" Her question had no heat. It was the plainness of a ledger entry. "No." He shook his head, but not to clear it. To confirm. "No, ma'am." Outside, the storm mumbled a last opinion. A stream that had been a trickle at noon ran quicksilver through the ditch honest water where there hadn't been any a breath ago. Truth had a way of arriving loud and leaving the earth brighter. He lifted the lamp. "Come on," he said. "Soup and dry clothes before you take a chill." He hesitated, something unpracticed on his mouth. "If you'd like to stay a spell longer than today." "On wages," she said. "And terms." "And terms," he agreed. 3 months, see how we sit after." A shape filled the doorway. The rain had just deserted, someone blocking what little light remained. Hat brim low, slicker, dripping smile wrong. "Well now," the man said, voice like a knife drawn slow to make a show of it. "If that ain't the runaway bride and the fool who gathered her." Randall Pike. The mare's ears pinned. Luke set the lamp down very steady, the flame holding even as the door swung wider on a wind that wasn't weather. "Evening," Luke said, as if greeting a neighbor on a clean Sunday. "Barns closed to company." "Town's got talk," Pike said. "Talk says you took what belongs to me." Joanna stepped forward before Luke could. She smelled whiskey and rain and cowardice. "I belong to no man who fears the sight of a strong woman," she said, and her voice did not shake. Pike's eyes glittered ugly. "You'll walk back to town with me now and apologize proper, or I'll teach you manners in front of your host." Luke's hand hovered where a revolver wasn't. He had left it in the house because chores were older than violence, and most days won without it. "Get off my land," he said. Pike smiled a thin saw blade. "Make me." Another flash stitched the hills, but held its thunder. The lamp's flame leaned and recovered small and stubborn. Joanna's heart learned a new rhythm storm on the roof, blood in the wrists, a mare's patient chew, and the slow click of a man deciding what line he would not let another cross. Shelter and trust. The last of the storm slunk into the hills, leaving the yard glossed with rain, and the world holding its breath. Pike had stood in the doorway long enough to stain the air with his grin, then flicked water from his slicker and said he'd be back with men who know a woman's place. He said it soft, like a prayer mangled into a threat. Then he was gone, boot heels sucking at the mud, until even the sound gave up. Inside the barn, the little lamp pulled their shadows in close. Joanna felt the ache under her ribs bloom to a steady throb. But it wasn't the worst thing she'd carried through a night. The mare chewed hay, as if to say storms past, and so would this. Luke set the hammer down. The muscles in his forearms still trembled in the after of it. "You hurt?" he asked, not moving closer, as if nearness were a door a man shouldn't open without permission. "I'll do," she said. "You're bleeding." He looked where her eyes went to a raw place along his knuckles, where wire had kissed skin mean. He made a non-committal sound. "I've had worse." "So have I," she said the words out before she reasoned them. She looped the lead rope over a peg and wiped rain from her brow with the back of her wrist. Stove still lit. "Sit." They crossed the yard single file, the mud wanting their boots. The sky was a sheet of pewter, turned on edge, its brighter rim sinking toward the far ridge. Stars hid behind the wet, but she could feel them waiting. Inside, the cabin heat cleaned the damp from the edges of everything. The fire had burned low. She fed it with 2 small splits and coaxed flame from coal. It caught slow and sure, licking the wood into bloom. "Water," she said, nodding at the kettle. He drew it off and poured into a basin. Steam rose. A curl of it caught the lamplight like a ghost of something kindly. She found a cloth old but clean and tore a smaller strip with her teeth. Luke sat because she told him to. Big frame adjusted to the narrow chair like a draft horse folded into a stall meant for something lighter. She took his hand. Calluses fit to calluses. The cut wasn't deep, but it had grit in it. She worked patient the way you do when time is both enemy and friend. He watched her face more than the work. She kept her eyes on the blood, the water clouding pink, and then, clearing the stubborn grain of a splinter, she teased out with a pin, and her breath set short so she didn't shake. He didn't wince, but she felt the small drag in his palm when the metal gave. "You sew?" she asked. "Or shall I?" His mouth tugged. "You'd sew me neater." He glanced to the mantel where a tin of needles sat, a woman's order held over from whoever tended this place before. "But the edges will hold with salve." She dabbed lard and pine pitch, wrapped the strip firm but not mean. His hand looked suddenly larger for having been tended. He flexed it once. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she said, more sharp than she meant. "It's work needs doing." He studied her, the quiet not empty, but full as a cup brimming exactly to the lip. "And you?" She stood. The room tilted a little. "I'll fetch bandages for myself." She meant a joke of it, and failed. The bruise under her ribs lit bright when she breathed too deep. His chair scraped. "May I look?" She weighed pride against sense, and found pride wanting for once. She turned the lamp a fraction down, not for hiding, but to take the edge off the room. When she lifted her blouse at the side, the air-kissed skin gone angry and blue. He swore soft in a way that didn't dishonor anything. "You'll be sore, but it ain't broken." "Storm wanted to take a piece," she said. It didn't. She found a length of cloth in the trunk's tray, wrapped herself with care she'd honed on other bodies, pulled the blouse smooth, and sat again, the breath in her chest settling into a cadence she could own. Luke ladled soup, beans, onion, a scrap of salt pork turned honest by slow heat. He sat across from her elbows, barely on the table the way men sit. When they remember manners they weren't taught, but caught from the right company. They ate with spoons that went quiet to the bowl and quiet back. It tasted better than it looked, which is the way of most true things. When he refilled her cup, he did it as if asking a question. She nodded because it seemed wrong to say no to warmth that cost no coin. Pike won't quit, he said at last. Men like him don't, she said. They don't have to practice cruelty. It comes when called. Town'll listen to him more than me. Luke said, not bitter, not resigned, just careful with what was true. He has shares in the mill, a hand in supply wagons. He buys rounds in the saloon and says God on Sunday. She took that in. What do you have? He looked around the small room like an auctioneer, taking inventory of a life. A stove that ate wood plain and regular. A bed with quilts pieced from other histories. A shelf with a Bible and a rope and a carved horse's head a child might have once loved. He smiled at nothing and everything. Fence posts, he said. A mare with more sense than me. A creek that runs if rain says so. He looked at her and the quiet grew another ring. A mind to not see you driven. The fire settled logs sighing into coal. She listened to the shiftings a house makes when it remembers it stands between a person and the night. What do you have? He asked a beat later, as if the question had taken its time to find the correct path out of him. She set her spoon down because the truth was easier to say with empty hands. I have my name, she said. I have the kind of hands that don't shake till the work is done. I have a letter that doesn't matter anymore, and a trunk that holds more thread than finery. I have anger. She let the word lie there, a coiled thing that didn't embarrass her, and a hunger for a place that doesn't ask me to be smaller to fit. He nodded as if she'd repeated his own thoughts back to him, dressed in her voice. This place, he said after a moment, asks only that you work and don't scare the horses. I can't promise town won't do worse than talk, but I can promise I won't. A kind of softness tried to cross the table then, the dangerous, necessary kind that turns strangers into something useful to each other. She almost let it then, felt the bruise flare, and remembered Pike's smile laid against the doorway like a bad joke. Terms, she said, putting a little iron back into the room. 3 months' wages in coin and board. I run your kitchen and keep your accounts clean. I don't touch your fences or your guns unless you ask it, and I agree. I won't be beholden to gratitude. Gratitude is a chain men use when they can't afford iron. Luke leaned back, considering. Wages fair, he said. He named a sum that didn't insult her skill and didn't pretend he had more than he did. Sundays, you choose church or chores. If you want the mare, you ride her. If you want your mail sent, I'll put it on the coach. And if I ask your help with fences or guns, he let that hang. I've a mind, she said, for what I will and won't do. Ask. She surprised herself with the last piece. Please. He touched the brim of a hat he wasn't wearing. Please, he said the word, fitting his mouth like it had been carved for it. The tension in her neck let a small measure go. They sat as the clock that wasn't there counted what it could, anyway, the length of a breath, the distance between two intentions, the way a name sounded in a room when spoken without harm. Wind went back to wherever it kept itself between shifts. Crickets tried a tune and gave up. The creek spoke loud from the swell the storm had given it. Town, she said at last, testing the sharp edge of the word. Tomorrow we'll need flour coffee lamp oil. I'll need thread. And courage. You've got the last, he said. Flour and oil I can help. He rubbed the heel of his hand against his jaw, watching the flame work. It'll be talk before we've tied the mare in front of the general store. You'll not be the one folks watch, she said, a ghost of humor in it. Women's sins draw more eyes than men's. He saw the truth of that and didn't try to argue her out of it. I can stand in front if it helps. Let me decide where I stand, she said, not unkind. Sometimes it's better for a woman to own the ground under her feet with witnesses. His smile was tired and approving both. Then I'll stand where you can find me if the ground turns bad. The lamp burned lower, as if to agree that plans were good until they weren't. She tidied bowls. He rose to help, and she waved him off with the authority of someone who'd commanded rougher men to sleep, to live, to stop bleeding. He obeyed because it made sense, and not because he was tamed. When the dishes were done and the room set for quiet, she stepped to the door. The night lifted its damp lid. Clouds were thinning. A handful of stars had pricked their way through. She could smell wet earth and the iron tang of lightning ghosts. "Sleep," he said behind her. He'd banked the fire so it would remember them till morning. "I'll take first watch." For what she asked, but she knew storms didn't always wear weather. Coyotes. Men who howl worse. She almost said she'd take second, then realized she didn't have to prove a thing tonight. "Wake me," she said, "if the howling comes with boots." He smiled with his eyes and not his mouth this time. "Yes, ma'am." The cabin had one bed and a pallet made neat by the hearth. Luke gestured to the bed as if it belonged to the nearest breathing body who needed it. She glanced at his shoulder, marked by old tidy scars, at the steadiness in his gaze, at the lines a life like his draws on a man who doesn't complain. She took the pallet without performance. "Good night, Mr. Carver." "Good night, Miss Hale." She lay on her side face to fire. Its light spoke of other rooms and other nights where she'd guarded men who didn't make it and a few who did. Her hands twitched as if to count pulses in the air. The bed frame creaked once and went still. She supposed he'd removed his boots and stretched out long bones arranged with care. A man who had learned not to fling himself at the dark. For a time sleep toyed with her and held back. She watched coals go to hollow red, and then bright again as a log found a vein of sap. Her breath learned the room's rhythm. The ache under her ribs turned into a boundary rather than a wound. Somewhere between one crack in the fire and the next, she heard it, the far-off murmur of men talking where men shouldn't be. She sat up. Luke had already rolled from the bed and found his boots without the floor complaining. He tipped the curtain with 2 fingers. Moon tried the yard and found it too wet to shine much. He listened the way men do when they've learned that listening is worth more than bravado. "Riders?" she asked, voice pitched low. "Not yet," he said. "But words travel faster than horses." He let the curtain fall soft. "Tomorrow's talk has started tonight." They stayed like that, a moment, 2 silhouettes made from the same single flame. "Sleep," he said again, and because it wasn't an order she did. Dawn came shy, as if not convinced the land deserved it. She made coffee while Luke stepped out to the yard, feet sure on the damp boards. The smell of the brew stood up like a man who'd been called by name. When he came back in, he set a small loaf on the table. "Mrs. Pike's sister bakes for coin," he said. "I'd sooner chew rawhide than hand her $1, but we'll have to buy flour from the same store until the mill forgets who helps it sleep." "Then we'll go," she said. She pinned her hair tighter, smoothed a skirt that had done hard service, and tied an apron, not as apology but as readiness. Let them look. He saddled the mare and a steady roan for himself. The ground gave beneath hoof and boot damp forgiving. The road was 2 ruts leading into talk. Copper Bluff wore sunlight badly after a storm. Mud shone where pride liked dust. Men leaned in doorways with pipes gone out. Women took laundry to lines and thought better of it, loops of rope hanging idle from pegs. They dismounted at the general store. The bell above the door announced them with too much cheer for the room it woke. Heads turned casual-like, eyes didn't. "Morning," the storekeep said. He was a thin man who had polished his politeness till it squeaked. "Mr. Carver." "Miss." He held the last a touch too long, as if waiting to be told what else to call her. Joanna let the silence do. The work names would not. "Flour coffee lamp oil," she said, steady. "Blue thread, if you've got it." "Blue," he repeated. "That's a fine color." He turned to the shelves, hands making a show of honest business. A woman near the bolt of calico whispered behind a glove that her, the one, got returned like a hat that didn't fit. Joanna felt heat under her cheeks and kept her eyes on the glass jar of rock candy as if it were a map of a gentler world. Another voice, lower, male Carver's, keeping her up there. Shame. Pastoral have a say. Luke stood behind her, not touching, but she felt him like a post set firm in the earth fence line that wouldn't wander. He stared mild as pasture at the 2 men by the flour bins until their mouths forgot what to do and shut. The storekeep set the sack on the counter. "Anything else for you, miss?" "Hale," she said, almost kind. "Joanna Hale." "Miss Hale," he corrected with relief. "Sugar." "Not today." He tallied coin. She paid exact. The bell jangled again. A breath of leave it alone air tried to come in and failed. Then the saloon doors across the street slapped twice, and Randall Pike stepped out like he owned noon. Two men came after shoulders sloped into trouble. He saw them, Joanna at the counter, Luke at her back, and tipped his hat with a flourish that mocked the word. "Well now," he said to no one and everyone. "Look what Charity dragged in. Joanna, turn the way you face a wind so it doesn't take you unawares." "I wouldn't know," she said. "I don't take it." Pike smiled. "Town's got standards. Town's got people," she said. "Standards are what folks hide behind when they don't wish to look at themselves." Someone snorted. Someone else said her name like it was a slur. The air inside the store thickened with the heat of bodies, pretending not to listen, and failing. Pastor Dunn stepped from the street into the doorway, caught in the hinge of two worlds at once. His hat was held respectful against his chest. Morning, he said the word tired. His eyes moved quick, counting souls like pennies. "Miss Hale, Mr. Carver," Pastor Luke said. Dunn nodded, set his boot to the threshold, and didn't cross. "There's been a discussion." He glanced toward the saloon and away. "Folks think it unseemly for an unmarried lady to be under a gentleman's roof." Joanna's mouth went dry, then wet with anger. She lifted her chin because lowering it would betray something precious. Unseemly is a man breaking his promise in front of a train and a town, she said. Unseemly is calling a woman fierce like it's a crime. A murmur ran the room like mice under floorboards. Dunn winced the way decent men do when truth blows past their tidy fences and into the street where anyone might step on it. "Miss Hale," he said soft. "You're welcome at the boarding house if Mrs. Winthrop—" She shut the door, Joanna said. "I slept on grain sacks." Pike laughed, delighted that the story made a sound he liked. "Carver's got better bedding, I wager." Luke didn't move. His palm rested light on the counter, but Joanna felt the whole weight of him aim between Pike's smirk and the door. He spoke to Dunn and threw him to the listening town. "Miss Hale works for me. Wages and terms. She's owed respect, same as any hand on my place." Pike clicked his tongue. "Hands don't wear skirts. Folks will talk till you fix it." A stillness not of peace slid in. Dunn's fingers tightened on his hat brim. "There's the matter of appearances," he said, and hated himself for saying it. Joanna could feel her heart tapping at the cage of her ribs, like a bird testing wire that had already cut. The store seemed to lean toward her. Someone's child dropped a penny. It rolled and found a knot in the floor and stayed there. She breathed once slower than fury wanted, and spoke. "Appearances are for men who would rather call something sinful than admit it makes them small. I will not marry to clean a picture for other people to look at." The word marry hit walls like a thrown dish. A woman near the thread rack sucked air through her teeth. Dunn shut his eyes briefly, as if asking strength from a god who had been stinted in his sleep. "Miss Hale," he said, "there's a dance at the church come Saturday. If you stand there under the light, folks might see what I see, a woman with a backbone the Lord himself could hang a sky on." Pike barked out a laugh. "Or they'll see Carver's shamelessness in daylight." Luke straightened by a fraction. "Enough," he said. Not loud. The sort of enough a river says when it eats a bank. Pike lifted his hands like surrender mockery in his wrists. "You'll hear from the committee." "Committee?" Joanna asked. "Of decency," Pike said merrily. "We form 'em when the season calls." Dunn flinched. "Mr. Pike." But the man had already turned to mud and street and rumor, his two shadows sloshing behind him like bad ideas. The store exhaled as if the weather had shifted again. Dunn looked at Joanna, apology, and something harder warring in him. "I can't stop their talk," he said. "I can witness yours." "Then do," she said before the courage could leak. "On Saturday." He nodded, grateful like a thirsty man at a pump. "On Saturday." Luke lifted the sack. Joanna took the oil and the thread. The bell made its foolish music as they stepped outside. On the porch, a stone clattered against the clapboard beside her shoulder and fell thudding into the flour sack at Luke's hip. It left a smear of wet dirt and a pinned scrap of paper under the nail the stone had carried. Luke plucked it free. The nail bit his bandage and came away with a dot of red. He read the scrawl and passed it without comment. The letters were big and angry and certain. "Send her back, or well do it for you." Mud sucked at the street. A crow flapped up from the trough, offended. Someone laughed too loud 3 doors down. Joanna held the note until the paper turned soft between her fingers. She looked past it, to the mare, to the road that ran back to the ranch, to the slope of hills that kept their own counsel. The bruise under her ribs thrummed like a warning drum. She tucked the note into her bodice, close to the place that still knew how to keep a pulse. "Let them come," she said, voice steady enough to surprise even her. "I'm not walking anywhere I don't choose." Luke's face didn't change, but something in the set of his shoulders did. He touched the brim that wasn't there again, a habit that meant respect when men like Pike meant threat. "Then we'll be ready," he said. They stepped off the porch together. The town watched with all its eyes. The threat returns. The sky put on its best innocence the next day, as if storms were only stories people told to make coffee taste stronger. Sun struck the puddles till they flashed like coins, and Copper Bluff walked about in its Sunday face, though it was barely Friday. The creek still spoke louder than usual, and the cottonwoods along its banks shook out their sleeves as if to dry them. Joanna didn't trust a day that acted clean when it wasn't. She braided her hair tight and tied on an apron the way a woman buckles a holster, quiet and decisive. Luke had said they'd go to town for the dance on Saturday as Pastor Dunn asked. Today they'd go for nail sugar, finally, and the kind of courage you bring home in sacks and jars, things that turn a house into a place people stay. "Take the roan," Luke said, tightening the cinch on the bay. "He minds good. If anything runs, it won't be the horse." "I don't run," she said. "Didn't say you did." They rode side by side along the road cut by wagons and arguments. The hills held the shape of the last storm. Stars would be brilliant tonight if clouds kept to their manners. Copper Bluff greeted them with the slow blink of a cat pretending sleep. The hammering at the new livery roof paused to watch. A woman shook a rug and forgot to beat it. Boys missed the can with thrown pebbles and shrugged like they meant it. They tied up at the rail outside the general store. Pike's men, 2 of them, thick in the shoulders and thin in the eyes, leaned on the saloon's front post and studied the street as if measuring boards for a coffin. Randall Pike himself wasn't in sight, which meant he was near. The bell over the store door jangled, as if it loved making foolish noises at serious moments. Mr. Barton, the keeper, arranged his mouth into a smile. "Miss Hale, Mr. Carver." 10 pounds of nails, Luke said, "and that sugar she didn't buy yesterday." "Blue thread again," Joanna added. "And oil." Barton moved with careful hands. "Committee met late," he said, like remarking on weather he didn't order. Pastor walked out before the end. "Good, Luke," said Simple as a post set straight. Barton swallowed. "Folks said words I won't repeat in here." Joanna let her gaze fall to the counter's worn edge. Men had counted coin and laid out notes here before. Some had paid, some hadn't. Promises were a kind of currency most folks spent easy. "We're buying flour from you, Mr. Barton," she said. "Not absolution." "Yes, miss." "Thank you, miss." He slid the sugar across as if it were contraband. "Dance tomorrow. Be good for folks to see you under the lamps." The lamps, that soft, warm light that turned faces kinder than they deserved. She imagined it hitting Luke's scar and making it a thing like any other line a life writes. "We'll be there." They stepped back into the day with parcels. The wind had curled like a dog at a doorstep and gone asleep too still. Luke shifted the sack of nails to his left shoulder. The saloon doors swung. Randall Pike came out with 4 No. 5 men behind him. He wore a coat too fine for a man who wished to look humble. His smile made a small cut in the air. Neighbors. Luke's jaw didn't move. "Pike." "Committee voted," Pike said, sauntering, as if the street were his parlor floor. "We posted a notice on the church door. Thought I'd bring you your copy in person." He held up a folded paper with an important-looking stamp that meant nothing outside of men convincing other men to be louder. Joanna took it. The words were hard and tidy. "A lady unmarried and without chaperone shall not abide in a gentleman's house overnight, lest the town's standings suffer. Compliance due by sunset Saturday." There was a round blot that wanted to be a seal. It looked more like spilled coffee. "No signature," Luke said. "Consensus," Pike said cheerfully. We do things decent in Copper Bluff. Decent, Joanna repeated, tasting iron. Like refusing a woman on a platform. Pike's eyes glittered. The men behind him shifted to see better. A boy stopped sweeping nowhere to hear everything. Dance tomorrow, Pike said, as if she hadn't spoken. You'll forgive us if we ask you sit it out, Miss Hale. Respectability. Innocence present. All that. Luke stepped a half pace. She's invited by the pastor, he said, voice quiet enough to make another man shout to feel he existed. She'll stand under the lamp like anyone with nothing to hide. Nothing to hide, Pike repeated, amused. Sleeping at Carver's place, and nothing to hide. He tipped his hat to her, with his wrist limp. You're fierce, I'll give you that. Men don't marry fierce. They break it or send it back east. I wasn't sent anywhere, she said. I came. I stayed. The street gathered itself tighter the way wood draws in around a knot. Joanna felt the bruise under her ribs say hello and hush. She put a hand there as if laying a book flat on a table. Chairman, one of Pike's men, said an ugly little word for a man who loved big ones. Maybe a lesson would settle it. Luke's eyes didn't leave Pike's face. No lessons today. You ain't gotta say, the man said. Town's doing this. Town ain't you, Luke said. Pike spread his hands. Now I'm the soul of patience, gentlemen. He slid his glance to Joanna and back. But when a woman's reputation gets confused with a man's loneliness, we correct it. Joanna heard the click before she saw the gun, the way a room changes when a man decides to be smaller than he could be. Luke didn't have his Colt. A man doesn't carry iron for flour. Pike's man, the lanky one with the wheat straw in his teeth, had already palmed his revolver to show he knew how. The world shrank to the doorframe's edge, where wood meets street, the distance from Luke's shoulder to that gun, the weight of nails in the sack his body would not use to shield himself. Joanna took one breath and made her decision on it. Randall, she said, stepping so the barrel's line had to cross her first to find Luke. You like crowds. You like words. Let's be clear. Something like surprise flickered. He felt it too, the whole town holding still to see if a woman would do the foolish, brave thing men count on when they're tired of their own weather. You will not tell me where to sleep, she said. You will not tie my name to shame because you don't own it. And if you intend a shot today, you'll wake to find the whole territory's eyes on your table. You think anyone cares that much for your principles? Pike's amusement frayed at one edge. I think men who hire drovers and make deals with mills care what the marshal writes if a woman falls dead in a street over a committee. Notice, she said, and wondered truly if the marshal would. It wasn't always the law that kept men honest. Sometimes it was counting. The wheat straw man Eckers, she remembered hearing someone say, shifted. The gun lifted a hair as if choosing nerves over thought. Joanna didn't flinch. Luke's breath came slow. She felt it, not saw it. Put it down, Luke said, looking not at the gun but at Eckers' mouth. You ain't the sort of man who sleeps right after firing at a woman. No one moved. A fly landed on the sugar sack and picked its way toward a grain of sweetness, as if this day were like any other. Put it down, came another voice, brittle with moral exhaustion and old courage. Pastor Dunn stepped between two barrels and into the shadow the saloon had thrown across the store's porch. His hat was off. His hair looked as if a hand had dragged it once and given up. Eckers, put it down, or I'll say your mother's name in church this Sunday with the word shame next to it. He didn't raise his voice, only broke it gently in the middle. I won't have us smaller than we already are. Eckers worked his jaw and spat the straw to one side. The gun sank not far, not fast enough. He slid it back into leather with a showy sigh. Weren't planning to shoot. Then don't plan to point, Dunn said, and looked suddenly older. Pike's smile hardened like a road in winter. Fine. If the lady wants to stand in lamplight tomorrow, she'll learn what light is for. We'll be taking names. Folks who dance with her, and folks who don't. You'll be counting men brave enough to lead, Joanna said, and turned before her mouth could make the next sentence crueler than she liked to be. She lifted the sugar. Luke took the nails. They walked into the street, because there's no dignity in edging sideways from a thing you were willing to face head on. The air felt thinner, but cleaner. She heard Dunn's sigh reach their backs, and Pike's laughter smash against it. The bells of neither church nor cattle rang. The town held its breath for later. At the ranch, the sky went hot and wide. Joanna set the sugar on the shelf and stacked the nails by the door. She took the blue thread into her trunk and shut the lid soft. The day had used itself up on talk. Evening would give it back in the shape of chores. Luke fetched the water and they scrubbed the table. He put the lamplight low, and the cabin looked like a place you could end a life in gently, not violently. She peeled potatoes. He sliced salt pork thin as paper. They moved around each other without touching, something like a dance learned without the naming of steps. When they ate, neither tasted much. Coffee helped. He set his cup down on the second swallow the way a man does when he's decided to say a hard thing and wants his hands empty. If you decide to take the boarding house until Saturday's over, he said, I'll walk you there and stand outside the door till sunlight. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. The words landed in her chest and turned into something she had to attend with both hands. That would make it easier for them to feel right, she said. I don't aim to help them practice being wrong. His mouth almost smiled. No. She held the cup tighter. Luke. Saying his name out loud was like stepping over a boundary and finding the ground good on the other side. I don't want to leave. Not tonight, not tomorrow. Not because fear asks. He nodded, neck stiff with the effort men spend to keep the right words from spilling out and changing everything too soon. Then, you stay. Silence sat with them like a third person who meant well and took the best chair. The fire made a small conversation with itself. The creek, swollen from yesterday's truth, kept speaking out of turn. After the dishes, Luke checked the windows and doors. She mended a sleeve by lamplight and stabbed her thumb only once. Blood dotted the blue thread. She sucked it away and left no mark you could see. Do you regret Boston? He asked from the doorway, not looking at her the way you ask the tender questions when you mean no harm. No, she said. I regret believing a promise without checking the man who made it. She watched her needle go in, come out in. Do you regret the war? He didn't move for a long while. Then he came to the table and sat across from her, hands palm down, as if to show them empty. I regret what it did to men who should have been farmers and fathers. I don't regret who I had to be to walk out alive. She tied off the thread and bit at the little snap like a secret kept. Who do you have to be now? He looked at the door, at the fire, at her. A man who stands in front of what's worth it, he said at last, and doesn't ask it to be smaller so he can feel bigger. Her breath hitched without pain for once. She set the shirt aside. Then stand with me tomorrow. I will. He banked the fire till it glowed like a heart you keep under a palm to make sure it stays. She laid out the pallet. He took the bed because it would have been a kind of lie not to change the pattern once you decided to live braver. He blew out the lamp. Night came helpful and full of small noises. Somewhere near midnight, a horse snorted outside like a man being told a joke he didn't like. Luke sat up. She did too before he asked. He lifted a corner of the curtain with one finger. Moonlight painted his knuckles pale. 2 riders at the fence, not close, not far watching. Not coyotes. Men who howled worse. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. When they turned their horses, the hoofbeats marked time for a song the town would sing tomorrow. Fear tried the door and found it latched from the inside. They'll test us under the lamps, she said into the dark. We'll give them something worth looking at, he said. She lay back down and stared where the roof met the wall. Stars pricked small holes in black. One cut a path and went out. Saturday put the air in a good suit and combed it. People filed into Copper Bluff the way water finds low ground inevitable. Lanterns were strung on wires between the church eaves and the cottonwoods, a necklace of small sun. Fiddle cases opened. Rosin burned sweet in the nose. Shoe leather scuffed for practice. Kids ran, were caught, ran again. Joanna's palms dampened under her gloves. Luke tied the roan and gave the knot an extra turn, the way a man says he'll be back in a minute with his body. Pastor Dunn stood near the door, sweat at his temples, though the evening wasn't cruel. He lifted both hands like he could bless everything and meant to try. Miss Hale, he said, voice, even eyes complicated. You come stand where the light is kind. She stepped into it. Warm yellow, honest, the kind of light that forgives a man's worst features and makes a woman's strength look like grace. People turned. Whispers fluttered and then roosted. Pike arrived last, as men who fancy themselves important do. His coat was darker than the night wanted. He took a place at the edge of the square where he could see and be seen, while pretending neither mattered. The fiddle slid into its first tune. Couples moved like ink poured slow. Dunn nodded to Joanna and then to Luke, as if pairing people were part of his ordination. Mr. Carver Luke offered his hand. He didn't bow. He blessed the moment by looking her in the eye. "Miss Hale," he said. Her glove found his palm. They stepped into the figure like walking into weather. The square turned them left and right, sent them forward and away, and back again. She heard herself laugh once, a small, startled thing that came out pure. The light made his scar a pale river crossed by a bridge of blue eye and steady mouth. It made her jaw the shape of a woman who would not yield, where yielding made people smaller. They moved without speaking because the tune did it for them. On the third turn, people began to choose. Some paired with them. Some peeled away sharp and regrettable. A woman she'd seen at the Calico Bolts stepped forward, cheeks pink with decision, and took Luke's hand when the figure changed. Her husband glared, and then, after a biblical pause, took Joanna's. The square breathed differently after that, less certain and more alive. Pike watched, counting. He put his hat to his heart like a man attending a funeral, and the joke of it made Joanna's stomach cold. When the tune ended, he clapped twice without smiling. "Fine show," he said. "Now the serious business." He nodded. Men from the committee fanned out with small books and pencils, ridiculous and dangerous. They marked columns, danced, divided by did not, as if marking sheep and wolves. Joanna felt heat rise not to her cheeks, but along her spine. She could stand a bullet better than being tallied like bad weather. She stepped forward, breath steady. "If you plan to count," she said, "loud enough for the numbers to hear, write my name clear. And under it write this: I stood where you told me not to, and the sky didn't fall." The square froze. Pike's pencil paused, then scratched something she couldn't see. Luke's voice came beside her, low and carrying. "Write my name under hers. And under that write, I didn't move her to make you comfortable." A woman near the pies put a hand to her mouth. Dunn shut his eyes and smiled the way a man does when prayer gets answered sideways. Pike's smile trimmed itself to a knife. "You both think this ends with dance and bravado, no?" Joanna said. "It ends when you realize I'm not leaving." He lifted the book, pretended to read. "It ends," he said with a warrant. He turned the page so only Dunn and those nearest could see. "Sanctimony suits men of God. Law suits men like me." Dunn swore softly, which made half the lamplight wink. "That's not Marshal Witt's hand." "Consensus," Pike said, again savoring the word. "Committee issued. Disorderly conduct. Public offense to decency." The air thinned. Luke's body shifted without moving closer. A shield you didn't have to wear to feel. Joanna heard the fiddle string snap in the player's sweaty grip, and the sound made the night feel too quiet. She tasted the note of fear and refused it. She set down the plate she had somehow picked up and threaded her fingers together so they wouldn't reach for a gun she didn't have. "Take me then," she said, "if your paper does what you say it does." A murmur opened. It sounded like men deciding whether to be the sort of men they told their sons they were. Two committee men stepped uncertainly forward, not marshal, not deputies, not sure. Luke's hand hovered, not touching her back. Not. "Joanna," he said. She turned her head an inch. The lamp stitched light into his eyes. The whole town leaned toward that single small distance. "If I walk," she said, "walk with me." He nodded once. Dunn moved too, hat in hand, jaw set. "And I." Pike's smile didn't break. It cracked. "All right," he said. "Walk then. Show the territory how lovers make a law. Lovers." The word slid under her skin and found places she'd been guarding with work and breath. She didn't deny it. She didn't claim it. She let it hang in the warm air between lamp and human faces, a truth that might be a truth that frightened other truths. She stepped forward. Luke matched her. Dunn kept pace. The square opened like a book. Half the town parted in approval. The other half hardened like dirt baked too long. A child dropped a ribbon. It drifted under the table and disappeared. The stars looked down and didn't blink. They reached the church steps. The lamplight gathered and warmed them as if this were a story told long after not a night that could still go any way. Pike stayed where the dark suited him. Consensus, he said again, trying to make the word the last one. Joanna turned and faced them all. Her voice didn't need to be loud. The light did some of the work. Tomorrow, she said, I'll bake bread. I'll mend fences if I'm asked, please. I'll ride out to the creek and watch the water tell the truth about the sky. But I will not go back. Not to Boston. Not to the grain sacks. Not to being small. You can keep your notice nailed to your own door. A sound rose, not a cheer, not a jeer, something human that split and joined again. A few clapped. A few spat. Most just breathed like they'd been told to for the first time. Pike's mouth made a promise his eyes had already signed. He touched the brim of his hat and left the square shadow swallowing shadow until he was a shape with boots, and then only a boot sound, and then nothing. The committee men folded their little books without tallying the courage before them. The fiddle tried again. The string held. Luke didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she felt the heat of him through cotton and decision. Dunn's hand trembled a little, not with fear but relief. The lamps hummed. The night ended not with a gunshot, but with a choice hung in warm air where everyone could see it. The reckoning. The storm came like a debt collector, slow at first, patient in the distance, then all at once at the door. By sundown, the ridge wore a crown of bruise-colored cloud. By dark, the first drop struck the roof with a knuckles insistence. The air in the cabin smelled of iron and wet pine. Luke banked the stove. Joanna laid out the lanterns and checked the wicks with hands that wanted work more than rest. They'll wait for weather, Luke said, listening to what lay beyond the walls, as a man listens for his name in a crowded room. Cowards like cover, she answered, knotting her apron, as if tying down her heartbeat. And committees like to arrive with witnesses asleep. Thunder unrolled from hill to hill. The creek, swollen from yesterday's truths, raised its voice till the windows hummed. Luke set the Colt on the mantel, and then thought better sliding it into a drawer. A child could not reach a habit he no longer needed and would not break. He checked the door latch. If it blows, it'll blow from the north. We board that wall and hold till morning. And if it's men, not wind? Joanna asked. Same remedy, he said, a scrap of grin ghosting his mouth. Hold till morning. She lit the lantern on the table and turned it low. Its circle of gold took a seat between them like an old friend who knew when to speak and when to warm the air without asking anything. The first hour of the storm passed in the work of waiting, rolling extra quilts, moving the trunk away from the draft under the door, laying a kettle to catch the leak that sang in the back corner. Only when the wind came from exactly this angle. Rain found the roof seams and read them like a map. Lightning stitched the sky. Thunder tugged the thread. Luke sat 3 breaths too long at the table and then stood. I'll walk the fence to the corral, he said. Gate latch went soft this morning. Don't want the mare testing it if she spooks. She wanted to say no. She wanted to say stay. Pride and good sense argued in her chest. Good sense blinked first. Take the slicker, she said. And call if the wind takes your hat. I won't have you cursing a brim while the world ends. He shrugged into the oilskin. The storm rode his shoulders bigger for a second when he opened the door, white fire making a silhouette out of the man who'd offered her a day and given her a place to stand. Latch the door behind me, he said. 2 knocks in your name if I'm back quick. Anything else you keep the bolt and take the back window. I'll be at the lamp, she said. Come home to it. He touched the brim, though he wore none, and stepped into a sheet of water that has never cared about anyone's plans. She shot the bolt and stood with her palms flat to the wood, as if she might feel his weight return through it. The storm shouldered the cabin, then relented, then came again with a new idea. She paced to the back window, lifted the muslin a finger width, and saw the yard change, shape's barn fence the dark nerve of the creek beyond where it shouldn't be this close. Minutes went by, measured in drops into the kettle, plink, 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 then one long pour, as if the roof had made a decision to quit. She took towels to the leak and wrung them out between her fists, water running down her forearms like lines a life insists on being known by. 2 knocks. Joanna. His voice was rain-battered near. She flew the bolt and opened to wind that shoved her 2 steps back. Luke ducked inside, slicker streaming, hatless, and grinning like a man who'd wrestled a gate and won. "Corral's holding," he said. "Mare thinks she's smarter than God. She ain't. What about the creek?" She closed the door on the lightning and catalogued him reflexively as she had 100 broken men breath, even pupils right-size color good under the wet. "Up," he said. "Won't crest if the ridge keeps it. Might rise enough to put a new shine on our yard." "Shine I can scrub," she said. "Mud I can fight. Men I—" She didn't finish because the wind made the wall groan like a ship that wanted another ocean. A new sound cut the yard, the wrong rhythm of hoofbeats finding the low ground near the cottonwoods. Luke went still the way wild things do when survival requires silence to be shaped like listening. "1 horse," he said. Then 2, 3. "Pike," she breathed. "Could be men drunk and lost." "Drunk men don't aim for gates," she said, and the thunder agreed. Luke crossed to the drawer, took the Colt out, and laid it on the table without touching it like a weapon, more like a tool you hoped not to need. He checked the lamp's wick with 2 fingers and drew it down till the room fell to a hush of amber. "Back room," he said. "If they knock, let me knock back first." The first knock that came wasn't knuckle to door. It was a voice slick with rain, and something meaner. "Carver, you decent enough to greet a neighbor in weather?" Joanna's body answered before her mind, heart to throat breath, to shoulder a pulse at her temples, that remembered everything it had survived and promised to keep pace through this, too. Luke slid to the door, put his weight to the hinge side, and lifted the latch, a whisper. "What's neighborly about trespass in a storm?" he asked without opening. Consensus Pike sang the word, thick as mud. "Committee says you harbor indecency. We aim to escort it back to town politely." "Town's asleep," Luke said. "Come back with morning." "Morning'll find sin has spread," another voice added Eckers, that wheat straw mouth. "We're the cure." Luke's hand hovered near the latch. His stance told Joanna everything he'd open, only if he had to, and then only the width of a lie. "Pastor Dunn will answer any committee you fashion," Luke said. "So will Marshal Witt." "Pastor prays," Pike said, amused. "Marshal naps." "We do." Rain shushed the edges of words. The creek shoved its shoulder against its bank and found a new seam. The lantern's flame drew small and blue for a second, then righted itself. Luke looked over his shoulder and found Joanna's eyes in the half-dark. He didn't shake his head. He didn't need to. She moved to the back room, but not far, just where a wall could brace her spine, and the doorframe could frame whatever she had to be. Her hand found a length of broom handle, the raw, honest kind of club a woman chooses, because it does not pretend to be more than it is. "Open polite-like," Pike called. "We'll not muss your floor." "No," Luke said. "Then we'll call the rain to help us." Pike answered cheerful as a hymn in the wrong key. "Eckers." The lamp. The back window blew white with lightning. The same flash framed 3 shapes at the eaves. A shadow rose toward the glass, then a hiss, oily chemical, a promise of worse. Joanna shouted before, thought Luke. He moved faster than the word shoulder to the door, yanking it wide, just as Pike's men reached to touch flame to the oil they'd spilled along the sill. The wind made a decision and came in with Luke. The flame shuddered and blew back on itself, licking the wet, as if surprised by its own appetite. In the same breath, Luke's fist found a throat at the threshold and drove it into darkness. A man went down in mud with a sound a man makes when his body remembers he's mortal. Eckers swore and swung the butt of his revolver at the jam. Wood splintered, the lantern's flame dipped. Joanna grabbed the kettle boiling since dusk and shot scalding water through the crack on instinct born of tents and fires and saving what you can with what you have. A howl answered that truth. "Back," Pike barked. "Back, you idiots. You want her to win by getting smart." Smart would be going home, Joanna said low to herself, and set the kettle back, with hands that trembled, now that they had nothing to carry. "Listen," Luke said, and it wasn't to the men. It was to the creek. It had come closer, the kind of close that changes a plan into a prayer. "They flood the yard, they'll have their cover, and drown themselves trying the door," she said. Eckers panted, coughing water and pride. You got till the next lightning to hand her over. Don't make decent men ugly. You did that work before you saddled, Joanna said. Silence for a heartbeat. Then the storm took a deeper breath, and the roof creaked the way an old man stands from a chair too low. The back wall shivered. A trickle found the floorboard seam and announced itself with cool toes to Joanna's boot. Luke flicked his eyes to the corner where the wall had lied about being tight. Cellar hatch, he said. We shore it, or we swim. I'll get the nails, she said. You hold the door. He didn't say be careful. He didn't say don't fall. He said 2 at a time, and she loved him in that second, for giving instructions the way you keep a person alive, small, exact, real. She ran for the bin. The lantern wobbled, the flame licked up tall and lean. Water took the back threshold, like a guest invited badly. She skidded to her knees at the hatch, and drove the first nail to the old board where it had wanted a new one for 3 winters. The hammer felt right in her hand, a different kind of saving than she was born to, but saving all the same. At the door, Luke cracked it to shove the barrel of his truth into the night. Next man through ain't walking back, he said, and the night believed him. Carver Pike called, voice losing its laugh. You really think you can hold a woman and a house against water? And men I've done worse, with less, Luke answered. Joanna sank the second nail until its head flashed quick under lantern light, like a star dragged down to earth. Water pressed the seam. The board moaned and held. Another, she said to herself. Another. Another. She didn't stop to name fear. She hammered it into place. The wind found its fullest lung and blew. The creek climbed the last 4 inches to the sill and spilled itself into their kitchen, tasting the table leg and finding it not to its liking. The lantern's flame went thin and blue again. She cupped it with her palm. Easy, she whispered, to fire and to herself. A shape landed hard on the back stoop. The window rattled with a man's weight. Joanna turned in time to see a boot heel through glass, and the frame give like a rib. The man pitched in, with the storm at his back, found slick floor, and slid. He came up, wild knife, out eyes, full of committee. Luke moved, but the room moved with him, water underfoot, table in the wrong place. The knife kissed his sleeve and found nothing but cloth. Joanna didn't think. She swung the broom handle, not pretty, not trained, and cracked the man's wrist. The knife leapt to the floor and learned to swim. Luke's fist did the rest of the talking the storm hadn't taken. Back window, Luke barked. He brought friends. 2 more shapes filled the hole like stories fill a mean mouth. Joanna grabbed the lantern and flung it to the table, then reached blind for the drawer. Her fingers found the Colt's cool cheek. She didn't know guns the way men did, but she knew lines and angles and what it costs not to act. She braced both hands and raised the iron toward the window. Don't, Luke said, not because he doubted her, but because he knew town would count it different. He blocked with his shoulder, shoved the table into the frame with a scream of wood. The men slammed against it like waves. The table held, then shuddered, then held. Cellar, he said, panting. If the creek takes the wall, we go down and crawl out under the eaves. We don't let the water teach us its lesson. Do you hear yourself, she said, a ragged laugh finding room in the exact wrong place. You're arguing with a river. Argued with worse, he said, and grinned. The grin made him look like the boy he'd been before the war, cut a map on his face. The next strike didn't come from the window. It came from the door, 3 men at once, shoulder to wood, a chorus of ugly. The latch screamed, the bolt bowed. Luke threw himself into it with all the forgiveness he had left. Go, he told her through his teeth. She didn't go. She shoved the washstand to the door's back, slopping water that had nowhere else to go. We can hold, she said. We can, he agreed, and that single we set a small fire in the middle of the flood. The door gave an inch, then 2. The washstand slid and thunked into Luke's boot. The men outside yelped when the wind hit them sideways with its own plan. Rain's taking the yard, Eckers shouted, not liking how wet a man could feel and still claim righteousness. Then drown your sin at home, Joanna shouted back. Last chance, Pike called. We pull the place down. We pull you out with it. We christen you in your own creek and call it justice. Justice don't need a mob, Luke said. Justice don't sleep in sin, Pike snapped. 3-2 lightning took the count and made it 0. Something cracked, post-branch or in tension. The door flew wide enough to take Luke with it. He disappeared into black and rain and men. The breath left Joanna like a candle in a window that hadn't been asked to guard a ship and try it anyway. She leapt for the jam and saw nothing but storm and a tangle of bodies. "Luke," she cried, and the sound drowned in water. A shot split the night, not hers, not his. A coward's noise. The flash showed her everything at once. A hatless man in the mud, a slicker in a flood. 3 figures struggling the creek, taking the yard like a thief who'd been shown the key. "Luke." She didn't hear an answer. The door ripped from her hands and slammed against the wall. Water punched her knees. She went down and came up with the taste of earth in her teeth. She grabbed the lantern, the only small sun left, and held it high under the eave. Its light made rain into strings of shining beads, beautiful and useless. "Luke," she called again, voice hoarse and small, against the bellow of a world unstitched. The light caught a shape beyond the steps, slicker, yes, and a shoulder she knew under any sky. He was there, half in water, half in mud, and then the water took the half she could see. "No," she said aloud to God and weather and men. "No." She ran into the yard with the lamp cupped at her belly like a living thing. The creek was a brown animal teeth, bared hungry for fence and man. She caught a glimpse of his face, under the boil, white, calm eyes closed, as if between one breath and the next, he'd decided to rest. "Luke." The word split her open. She stepped until the current loved her skirt, and tried to make off with it. The lamp guttered. She crouched to shelter it, and felt the water rise to her thigh with a lover's insistence. "Joanna." Pastor Dunn's voice, impossible, fierce somewhere near the cottonwoods. "Back. You'll go with it, Luke's there," she shouted already, not believing the space between her and the shape the water had stolen. She moved another step. The ground vanished. The creek took her ankles and grinned. Hands caught her from behind neighbors, maybe. God, stubbornness wearing skin. She fought as a drowning person fights hard and stupid and honest. The lamp jerked. Flame went thin, then out, then no caught again. A thread of gold and a wall of black. Back Dunn said, both arms around her waist, anchoring her to something that wasn't mercy but muscle. "You can't save a man by dying, then throw a line," she sobbed, hating the sound of it. "Throw anything." "Can't see him," another voice said, despairing. She saw him. She would always see him in the slice of lightning that gave her one more truth before it ran out of charity. The slicker rolled, hit a snag of fence, then slid free like a hand letting go. "Luke," she whispered, and all the fierceness she'd been accused of failed to hold the world still. Back Dunn said again, dragging, pleading, "You'll freeze, and then it'll all be for nothing." The creek roared. The lamp burned on her belly, small and furious. The night gave her no answer. They got her to the steps. She stumbled inside as if the threshold were a shore and the floor a continent where men lived and survived and went on offending the sky by asking for tomorrow. She set the lamp on the table with fingers that had forgotten the grammar of touch. The flame jittered and held. She pressed both hands to her ribs, to bargain breath into working. Dunn stood in the doorway, sopping hat, gone eyes, gutted by what he hadn't been able to do. "I'll ride for help," he said, useless and necessary at once. "When the water thinks better of itself." She shook her head and nodded in the same movement. Words weren't the tool she needed. The storm had broken them. Someone put a blanket around her shoulders. Someone else said the mare was safe. The world had shrunk to the size of a small stubborn light on a rough-hewn table, and the space beside it where a man's cup had been. "Luke," she said softly to the flame, to the house, to whatever hears prayers not meant for church. "Not like this." The storm answered in its own language. The creek bargained with the yard. The lamp threw gold on the wall in a shape like a man with his head bowed. She bent over the light and sheltered it with her hands until her palms went hot and her breath fogged the glass. A woman's body convincing fire to live because she needed one thing in this room to obey. Outside, the thunder moved a field away. Rain softened from fury to persistence. The creek kept the shape it had stolen and made a case for keeping it. Joanna knelt on the wet floor that had become a kind of altar and pressed her forehead to her clasped hands, a nurse's posture and a child's both true. "If there's mercy left in this county," she whispered, "let it burn here until he finds his way to it." The lamp flickered, wavered, then climbed. She breathed once, twice, a third time, the count a woman uses when she forgets how to do it and must teach herself again. She lifted her head and stared at the door until it was only wood and not a mouth that had swallowed what she loved. The storm bled away to a sullen drip. The creek talked quieter hoarse from shouting, the window broken and boarded by a table and a will kept most of the night out. Joanna stayed on her knees with the light cupped in her hands like a promise she could make if no other would. The storm did not stop so much as forget its rage. By dawn the clouds unraveled into thin wool. The creek coughed itself back inside its banks with the embarrassment of a drunk stepping off a porch. On the table the lamp burned steady. Joanna had nursed it through the hours, refusing even the wind a chance at triumph. Her hands were raw from shoring the hatch and wringing towels. Her eyes felt scraped clean. She had prayed without shape the way a person breathes, when they've lost the trick of it and must learn again. The yard steamed. Broken branches lay like antlers in the grass. A board from the north fence had traveled half the distance to the cottonwoods and rested as if it would take root there. The door hung on its hinges, ragged from the night's argument. She stood in the wreckage with the blanket still around her shoulders and tried to make her body believe in morning. "Luke," she said, a word shaped like a cup she carried to the threshold and held out to the light as if it might fill. Silence answered with the small noises of exhaustion, the drip from an eave, a sodden rope slapping a post, the mare's soft wicker from the dry stall. Pastor Dunn had found the sense to bar before the creek took it. Joanna breathed once for counting's sake, twice for the stubbornness that had kept the lamp alive, and a third time for mercy she could not order. Then she stepped into the yard. Mud took her boots and asked for more. She kept what she needed. The cottonwoods glistened, every leaf a small coin minted by weather. She scanned the ragged edge of the creek for slicker cloth, a hat brim a miracle. The creek pretended innocence, running brown with secrets it would not give up. "Miss Hale," Pastor Dunn's voice, husked, urgent, rose from the fence line. He moved toward her with the careful speed of a man who'd prayed all night and earned little but dawn. "The ridge gave up timber," he said, lifting a hand toward the bend. "There's a tangle there, nets anything foolish enough to test it." "Foolish?" She almost laughed. He was saving a gate. Dunn lowered his eyes as if he'd been scolded by his own sermon. "Forgive my tongue. Come, we'll check." They picked across the yard and into the lower pasture, where grass lay plastered in one direction like hair after a hard bath. Every few steps the ground tried to take Joanna, and every time she took herself back. When they reached the bend, the creek narrowed into a throat of rock and root. Flood-borne branches had wedged themselves in a makeshift lattice. The water hissed through the teeth of it. "Careful," the pastor said. "Banks undercut." She stooped, scanning the snarl, and something moved where water muscled through. Not a man. A log. No, a shoulder. A shape in the wrong place, and thus exactly the right one. "Luke," she whispered, as if his name might turn the current. There, she kicked off the bank and slid to her knees, palms stinging on the grit. There, a slicker sleeve tangled on a gnarl of root. A hand the color of new paper drifted and caught again. "Hold me," she said, not looking to see if Dunn had the strength. She took his arm like a post and reached with the other body, stretched along the bank until water slapped her collar and drank down the threadbare warmth at her throat. Her fingertips found cold skin. "Luke," she said, and her voice broke on the rock. The hand twitched bone, remembering. She hooked her wrist under his, the way you hook a man's life to a stretcher in a night tent, with the world split open outside, and felt the terrible weight of a living man whose body had been asked to be a river. "Pull," Dunn said, and did, and the bank moaned. They did not move him out so much as the creek gave him back insulted. His shoulder dragged the root like a reluctant child. His hip bumped a rock and decided to live. Then they had him on grass that tried to be ground again. He coughed once water and mud, and something like a prayer. When he opened his mouth the second time, the sound was a man's, not a flood's. Joanna fell forward and pressed her forehead to his collarbone. Her hands learned the old work without instruction, the heel of her palm to his sternum, 2 fingers at the side of his throat, an ear bent to his mouth. Pulse thready, stubborn. Breath uneven, present. She turned him and pressed. Water fled him in a cough that shook his ribs under her palms. He groaned like a gate that has remembered its duty. Easy, she said, which was a lie and a command. Easy now. His eyes opened in narrow, pale slits, the blue of midday seen through smoke. They found her. They tried to focus. They did. You, he said, the tiniest smile, insisting on itself at the corner of his mouth. You kept the light. I did, she said fiercely, and the fierceness softened into everything else there was. Dunn crossed himself in a way that looked more like habit than doctrine. I'll fetch blankets, he said thickly, and men with hands that can lift careful. Thank you, Joanna said without looking away from Luke. Bring coffee if the Lord has any left. Dunn snorted something like a laugh and stumbled toward the house. She touched Luke's face, the scrape along his cheekbone where the creek had signed its name. You left your hat, she whispered, washing mud from his eyebrow with the tail of her sleeve. I told you to call if the wind took it. Wind took me, he rasped, a splinter of humor in his throat, didn't know where to send word. Here, she said, pressing his muddy hand to her chest, so he'd be sure. You send it here. He shut his eyes as if the truth stung worse than the water. Joanna, he said, and she heard an apology begin to shape itself. No, she said, not that word. Not from you. You went where a man goes when he tends what he loves. The sentence surprised her with its nakedness. It did not embarrass her. It freed her. I love this ranch because you do. And I. She stopped breath, catching. On the one piece of debris, words have always found the moment before they become the only possible ones. His fingers tightened with the smallest insistence. Say it, he said, hoarse. It felt like a man who'd walked a long way asking for water and meaning only what he meant. She took his face in both hands and let herself be done with caution. I love you, she said, and the creek had the decency to run quiet for a full heartbeat. His eyes opened. They did not flash. They warmed from the inside. I believed I'd earn hearing that in some gentler season, he whispered. Forgive me for wanting it anyway. Live, she said. Then I'll choose a season every morning. Men came with blankets, and a door-turned stretcher breath, steaming clothes still wet from their own roofs. Dunn followed with a kettle that had remembered coffee. They wrapped Luke and lifted as if a barrel could bruise and might forgive them or not. Joanna walked beside, one hand on the door edge, the other holding the cup like sacrament. Inside, the cabin smelled of wet wood and effort. She knelt by the hearth and brought the fire back from its patient weight, coaxing flame from coal with the same insistence that had carried the lamp through the night. Stay, she told it, and it did. She cut his slicker from him in careful strokes, cloth fused to skin where the creek had pressed him into cold. His shirt peeled away with a sound she would remember. Beneath bruises wrote their dark grammar ribs shoulder, a rake of scratches his body had earned down a bank. She flushed hot with the clean anger of it, and then let it go so she could do the work. Whiskey Dunn asked as men do when they can't stitch and need to hand you something. For his mouth and mine, she said, gentler than it sounded. Then clean water. She bathed him in small sections, cloths warmed in a bowl wrung to the edge of comfort. He shook once the cold, leaving him with a complaint. She set her palm to his shoulder and hummed a few raw notes not from any hymn book. Dunn would recognize just the way a person makes their throat into a room where another can breathe easier. Luke watched her eyes, more open now, the color back under the scrape. You've done this 1,000 times, he said each word, travel stiff. More, she said. Never thought to do it because I was glad the man stayed. She smiled, wrecked honest. You are staying. I'm slow to go, he said, and it made her laugh for the first time in a day that had not remembered laughter's use. She bound his ribs snug so pain would have to ask permission before it moved. She stitched a deeper cut along his forearm with thread boiled in a tin cup and a needle she'd set aside for a moment like this, without knowing so. He held still as a post. Every time she said almost, he breathed like a man who trusted the word to be true. When she tied off the last knot, he caught her wrist with the same gentleness he used on the mare. "Joanna," he said, "what I feared was never your fierceness. It was my fault. I kept my life small enough to carry in one hand. Then you walked into it, and I needed both." She swallowed against the way tears distort light. "You weren't afraid of me." He lifted their joined hands an inch. "I was afraid of wanting what I didn't believe survived men like me."